Today we swipe, tap, and buy things with credit cards. But what if you had no bank, no credit, and not a single coin to spare? That was everyday life for medieval families. So how on earth did they survive, raise kids, and stay fed with no money? The answer lies in their cleverness in using their limited resources. Let's have a look at that in today's video. Long before Venmo and credit scores, bartering was the real economic engine of the Middle Ages. In fact, across 10th to 13th century Europe, peasants rarely saw money or coins at all. Instead, people traded what they had in exchange for what they needed. For instance, a blacksmith in 12th century York might repair a plow in exchange for a sack of grain. A woman in a French village might trade goat milk for spun wool. And this wasn't just peasant culture, nobles got in on the action too. In 1154, documents show that the Abbey of Bury St. Edmunds in England traded brewing rights to a local innkeeper for barrels of ale and firewood. Bartering was localized, face-to-face, and based on trust, or at least on reputation. So if you tried to be crafty and mix water into the wine you're selling, people would definitely tell others, and you would likely lose future customers. In a world with no banks and little coin, your skills, goods, and even your animals were your currency. There are records from 14th century Florence of debts being settled with livestock, and even chickens being accepted in court settlements. Though it's fair to say that that sort of thing does still survive in some form today. Walmart? Whole Foods? Yeah, forget about it. Medieval folks were their own food supply chain. Most peasants lived on manorial estates and were granted strips of land in large open fields to grow crops. This system helped share good and bad soil fairly. By the 11th century, in places like rural England and Normandy, the average peasant family grew staples like barley, oats, leeks, and cabbages. Yes, lots of cabbages. Bread, made from coarse ground rye or barley, was the cornerstone of every meal. Gardens were crammed with herbs like sage, parsley, and thyme, not just for flavor, but also for medicine. Chickens roamed freely, providing eggs and the occasional Sunday roast. Pigs were prized because they could eat anything and fatten quickly. Even monks at Westminster Abbey kept pig pens. The three-field rotation system became common by the 13th century, ensuring soil didn't get exhausted. One field was for spring crops, one for autumn, and one left empty, basically giving the soil a little break to recover the minerals. They had food growing in their backyards, and creating meals from those ingredients was a far cry from what we know today. A typical peasant meal was humble but surprisingly balanced. In the 13th century England countryside, for example, a common dish was pottage. This was a thick stew of beans, peas, onions, and whatever vegetables were in season. Add a hunk of dark bread, and you've got dinner. In fact, bread made from barley or rye was eaten daily. It was heavy, chewy, and full of fiber. And there weren't many picky eaters in medieval homes, so if you were a child who refused to eat what was on the plate that night, there was no second option waiting. Back in these days, animals weren't just pets, they were walking investments. Every family that could afford it raised livestock. Even the poorest peasants often kept chickens or a pig. By the 12th century, animal husbandry had become a vital part of rural life across Europe. Cows were incredibly valuable, not just for milk, but for producing manure to fertilize fields. In 13th century France, village records show cow ownership was often communal and shared between two or more families to split the cost and care. Pigs were ideal for small plots. They ate scraps, grew fast, and didn't need grazing land. In fact, a 14th century English law allowed villagers to drive pigs into royal forests to forage, which was called pannage. Sheep were prized for their wool, a major trade good. In places like Flanders and northern Italy, entire economies revolved around sheep farming. Goats, on the other hand, were hardy and ideal for hilly terrain. They gave milk even in tough conditions. Raising animals was daily, smelly, noisy work, but it kept bellies full and clothes on backs. But if you find these medieval survival tactics as fascinating as we do, give this video a like and hit subscribe. There's so much more history hiding in plain sight, and we're digging it all up, so stay tuned. Now, let's be honest. When the garden didn't grow or the pantry got low, medieval families turned to nature like their life depended on it, because it pretty much did. Foraging was a weekly routine, especially in forested regions of Europe. Kids and adults alike gathered wild mushrooms, berries, hazelnuts, and herbs like nettle and sorrel. In fact, stinging nettle soup was a springtime favorite. It was loaded with iron and way cheaper than meat. By the 12th century, in places like England, hunting was strictly regulated. Deer, boar, and rabbits in royal forests belonged to the king. If you were caught hunting illegally, you could lose a hand or even your eyes. Despite that, though, sneaky hunting happened using snares and slings to catch birds and hare. Fishing in rivers was safer and often legal for villagers. Even eels were a big deal. Monasteries in medieval England farmed them in ponds as a reliable protein source. I gotta be honest though, I definitely wouldn't have survived in these times because I hate fish. When your small plot couldn't feed the family year-round, you found work, especially during harvest or planting seasons. That's where seasonal labor came in. By the 13th century, rural Europe had a steady rhythm of agricultural jobs tied to the seasons. Come spring, there was sowing. In summer, weeding and tending. Then came autumn, the most critical time, the harvest. Entire families often worked together in the fields. Even kids were sent out to help, especially during harvest time. Wages weren't always in money. Sometimes you got paid in food, clothing, or even permission to take home leftovers, called gleaning. What's gleaning? I'll explain this practice in detail in just a minute. Women found work too, brewing ale, spinning wool, or helping with lambing. Sometimes towns needed extra hands for bridge repairs or festival setup, which offered side income. These jobs were temporary, but plugged financial holes when food ran short. And if you thought job competition was a modern thing, you better believe people competed for these jobs. Getting picked for seasonal work could mean the difference between comfort and hunger that winter. Now that we know a medieval home was your own little factory, families didn't just survive, they produced. Spinning wool, brewing ale, baking bread, even candle making happened right at home. In fact, by the 12th century, English tax rolls mentioned entire households producing goods for local trade. And here's the kicker. Women were often the CEOs, more or less, of these tiny home businesses. A widow with a loom and a few sheep could literally keep her household afloat. Cottage industries weren't just side hustles, they were survival plans. Before factories, every product started in someone's cottage. You made what you needed, sold the rest, and hoped the weather, and the Lord, cooperated. A bad wool season or a spoiled brew wasn't just a bad day, it could ruin you. It might sound generous that the church let peasants glean leftover crops, but let me explain. You see, peasants were required to give a tenth of everything, crops, eggs, even honey, to the church. That's the tithe. And yeah, it was required even if your family was starving. Gleaning was their only chance to pick up leftovers by hand after the rich were done. It was a right in many areas, like 14th century England, where peasants could legally gather leftover grain after the harvesters had gone. It wasn't a kindness, it was a law and custom. In 14th century France, gleaning was allowed only after the landowner gave the nod. And you had to use your hands. Some villages watched gleaners like hawks. Get caught taking too much, and you might be fined or even banned. Still, for many poor families, gleaning meant one extra sack of grain or handful of beans, and that could be the difference between hunger and a meal. You know when people say you were robbed of your childhood if you didn't experience a certain game? Forget about the idea of childhood as a carefree time in these days. In medieval families, everyone worked. Kids as young as 5 herded geese, hauled water, or helped in the fields. By their teens, most were full-on laborers. There was no daycare, hardly any school, and your parents were your teachers, and your siblings your co-workers. And yet, families were deeply tight-knit. They had to be. In a world without hospitals, insurance, or pensions, your survival depended on your blood. When someone got sick, the family treated them. When someone died, the family grieved and took over their duties immediately. Elders were rarely abandoned. They were knowledge keepers and child minders. Cousins, uncles, even neighbors often functioned like extended family. In times of famine, plague, or war, family wasn't just your emotional support. They were your emergency plan. Believe it or not, some of the biggest helpers for poor families were monks. Medieval monasteries weren't just places for prayer, They were lifelines. Many grew their own food, kept animals, and stored grain. When famine hit or winter was brutal, monks often gave bread, ale, and even medicinal herbs to the needy. In England, the famous monastery at Glastonbury ran a hospital and offered food to travelers and the poor as early as the 12th century. Some monasteries even built almonries, special rooms just for handing out food. Remember that priest in an RPG who would call alms for the poor? Yeah, that was these guys. But this kindness wasn't exactly free. You might have to attend a sermon or help with chores in exchange. And supplies were limited. First come, first served. Still, for many families with nothing left, the church door was the last one they could knock on. So, if you had to survive like a medieval peasant for 1 year, no money, no supermarkets, just pure survival and natural instinct, do you think you could handle it? Let us know in the comments below. Now check out this video on the most disgusting 9-to-5 jobs in the Middle Ages. We'll see you there.